Okay, so just to review one more time, mental operations are called cognitive processes. These are the things that we actually do with our system. We need energy. We need fuel to be able to do this. And those are called processing resources. And we store this so that we can draw upon it when we need it. And we store this in a central pool. Well, the question then becomes, well, what happens when we don't have enough resources to act and to engage in all the cognitive processes that are necessary? What happens when we're asked to do X? We need X amount of resources, and we don't have them. You go to the well, you go to the pool, and they're not there. We don't have enough. Right? Well, one of two things is likely to occur. Okay? Either we're going to do that process anyway, but we're not going to do it well. Or we're going to do part of it, but not all of it. A similar question would be, what if we have to do multiple activities? What if we have to engage in multiple cognitive processes? And that's not unlikely in our normal environment, right? We want to be able to focus on a conversation, and that's a cognitive process, right? We have to pay attention, we have to listen, we have to process, we have to understand and interpret. At the same time, we have to ignore perhaps other inputs. So we're ignoring the background noise, or we're ignoring another conversation that's going on at the same time, or we're ignoring our phone that's ringing, or we should be ignoring our phone that's ringing. That seems to take precedence sometimes, but we should be ignoring that. Okay? And again, there are only X number of strategies. One is we can take all the resources that we have available, focus them on what we really think is important, and do that as best we can and just ignore everything else. But we don't do those then. Or we do everything, but we do all of it poorly. In either case, overall performance is going to deteriorate. Okay? The resource allocation models assume that brain damage reduces the amount of available processing resources that are in the pool. If you think of the pool as kind of a savings account, and that every time we want to write a check, we have to transfer money from our savings account to our checking account so that we can actually write that check. What this model is telling us is that your savings account is just depleted. You won't have enough money to keep on writing the checks. You're not being asked to write more checks than everybody else has to write. You're being asked to do what everybody else has to do, and it's normal processes. You just don't have anything to back it up. You don't have enough to back it up. Okay? And some would say that that's perhaps what aphasia is we just don't have those processing resources in the pool. Okay? We could actually play a nuanced game with this and say, well, is it that the resources are lost or that they're just not available? That should sound like a familiar question given our quandary in how to define aphasia. But that's not really relevant so much to the resource allocation model. In either case, it's just not there. Whether they're there but not available or whether they don't exist at all is not relevant. But right now, what we're faced with is that we have processes in which to engage, and we might be able to do those processes in theory. We just don't have enough resources to support the normal quality or quantity of processes that we're being asked to engage in. Well, okay. Well, then that really brings us to the question of what do we do about that? Can we actually increase the number of resources that the patient has? Well, that's not easy. That's not easy, even on a conceptual level. How can we even think about how we could do that? We can't, inject it. We can't import it from someplace else. And perhaps that's what recovery is about. Perhaps that's what natural recovery is about. What we can do, because we're behavioral people, is we can somehow create a situation where the patient can focus processes without complicating it. So, for example, I gave you an example before where a patient needed to pay attention to an auditory signal, but there were competing signals. Well, then simple way to make that a better situation is to get rid of the competing signals. Have the patient not have to deal with filtering out other noise. Get rid of the noise. Have the patient do therapy. Have the patient function communicatively where there are no competing issues. And so that whatever resources are available will be focused on the task that is important at hand and not incidental task variables that aren't related to the treatment objective. Yeah, can we all do that? Sure. Because we've got lots of resources. We've got lots of abilities. And so, within a certain reasonable amount of time, we can sit in a restaurant and we can have a conversation with the person that we're with, even though at the table next to us, or perhaps on the loudspeaker, there are other auditory signals, but we don't even hear them. In fact, if you think about it later, you have no idea what they were talking about. You don't really know what kind of music was being played. You don't know because you never processed them at all. But that took an active, frankly, filtering. And you really had to make sure that that didn't enter into your sphere of processing. Because if it did, you would have trouble with it. It's this whole notion, and the resource allocation model actually speaks directly to the whole notion of multitasking. And I know we all would like to think that, we can multitask, right? And some of us will contend, and I'm not in a position to deny what you can do and what you cannot do. I don't know. I know what I can do and what I can't do. I don't multitask really well. Okay, I need to focus on doing what I do. And so that if I want to read a book, and I really want to focus on what I'm reading, and I want to remember and understand what I'm reading, then I don't have another auditory signal or any other signal going on at the same time. So I don't turn on the radio. I don't put a CD or other music on unless it's nonverbal and it's just kind of there in the background. And maybe that, is something I can deal with because there's no linguistic processing. But certainly songs that have lyrics, I can't have those in the background and read and do that optimally. I can't do that well. Right. Some of us contend that we can only do that when we multitask. We can only study well when there are multiple inputs. I frankly, I'm not denying that. I don't understand it. And I can't even understand I can't explain how that actually is better when you have that kind of competition. It would seem to me the logic is different. The resource allocation model certainly would not endorse multitasking, simply because we should be able to focus our resources on the process at hand, the thing that is most important to us. Okay. What we do know for a fact is that patients do not multitask. We're glad if they can task, if they can do what they need to do. But what we're going to spend considerable time talking about now is how do we actually and how do we think about structuring our therapy so that we don't have competing need for resources where the competition is really not relevant. It's not really what we want, where we can focus and structure our therapy so that it is geared specifically to what we want to happen in therapy. So let's look at that now. We're going to look at a number of different factors now. Let's begin with something that Brookshire calls, that the model calls intensity. Let's just look at that one word first, intensity. We know the word intensity. Usually we use that when we talk about hearing, right? You all learned that word in audiology and acoustics. And intensity is basically loudness, right? But intensity is loudness only in an auditory sphere. We also can talk about intense colors, can't we? We can talk about like a deep color, a clear, let's say red, an unambiguous red, a red that is just clearly red. It's intense red. As opposed to, yeah, it's reddish, it's pinkish, maybe salmon, maybe, a little bit light purple or something. It's in the red family, but it doesn't have intensity, okay? If I actually wanted a person, and again, I'm giving you examples that are probably not going to happen in therapy, but they're just examples. If I wanted to have a color representation for the word red, because I'm going to work on that, and I'm going to have the person pick the red something or other, then if I wanted to make it as unambiguous as possible, and so that the patient doesn't use resources to interpret the stimulus, but the stimulus just kind of announces itself, then I want that red to be intense. Not for the patient to say, yeah, that's probably red. That's the reddest thing that I have there, because what I'm actually seeing are like shades of red. But it's not really red. It's just sort of red, and it's in the red family. Well, as soon as it's not really red, then the patient's using more resources to come up with the red identification. And so if we want to make the stimulus as readily apparent as possible, then we want to make sure that the stimuli are intense. Now, I chose color, okay? That certainly could be loudness, okay? Does that mean that every auditory stimulus has to be shouting loud? No, not at all. It has to be adequately intense. In other words, unambiguously intense. Loud enough, and that's based on that person's hearing, by the way, not based on your hearing. Loud enough so that the person hears without having to strain. Because as soon as they have to strain to hear, then they're using more resources, and then they don't have enough resources perhaps to understand what they heard or to even perceive it. Okay? So we want intensity to always be adequate, comfortably adequate, maybe a drop more than adequate, so that the person's not trying doesn't have to try to interpret it. Okay? I think all of you have been exposed to a situation where you have heard perhaps a lecture or a sermon or a conversation where it's loud enough, but you're really straining. It's not comfortably loud, it's just loud enough. And within not so much time, you're tired. And you get up from that situation and you're exhausted and you haven't done anything but listen. And compare that to a situation where the loudness is more than adequate, and you're comfortable with that, and you're okay, and you actually understand it better because you didn't waste your energy, your resources in listening, okay, because it was adequately intense. Okay, we're going to stop. We'll come back to salience.